We had decided that we're going to do this every 3 years, but came 2015, and already at the beginning of 2015, as we were discussing the conference again at the end of the year, we had a watershed moment in South Africa. The Fallist movement, the students' protests in 2015, leading right up to 2016. It was a dramatic experience throughout the country that woke us up to the idea that there was a lot that remained to be done in South Africa. At the same time, the Black Lives Matter movement had emerged in the United States. And in Australia, the Aboriginal people were starting to demand from their government recognition for their pain and suffering. Mind you, this is now decades before our own experiences of apartheid and the resolution of the apartheid era. So there were conversations across the globe. In South America, in the US, the slavery question was re-emerging in the US. And to the extent that scholars were beginning to do something about this, Georgetown University started a major research operation looking at the impact of slavery, their own implicated story with the story of slavery. They started to research the history of the descendants of the slaves they sold at the university in order to help the university as it was fledgling, it was struggling financially. And they did a major study and identified direct descendants of slaves they sold in Georgetown in the 18th century. And they asked the question, what do you do about it? And this is the question that occupies our minds as we enter this phase of asking questions about this model that everyone had embraced, that the UN is now using in every country, but there are questions that are not being asked. Questions about what is happening to this generation now. And South Africa is a very important site, precisely because the language of reconciliation dominated our public discourse and debates about a historical trauma and was sent out and repeated throughout the globe. Now we have to come back and really, in a way, go back to the drawing board. What about those who are implicated? Michael Rothberg speaks on Saturday on this question of the implicated other. This morning, we're going to have a keynote reflecting on these tensions around the subject of reconciliation. I want to say something very specific about the kinds of people who come to these conferences. You will notice that one of the things that we do at these conferences is to invite victims, survivors, children of victims and survivors, so that we have a sense of what is it that our theories are saying and how in relation to the experiences, the direct experiences of people who have suffered these traumas. So we started the secret rousing dialogues, and we have them again today. Among the groups that we have had in the past, we've had groups of people who represent the Palestinian pain. In 2006 and 2009, Jessica Benjamin, who is here again today, with her group who had worked in Palestine, brought her story of the work that she was doing among Palestinians. And I remember that at the conference in 2009, when she presented on a panel with a group, the story of dialogue and engagement among Palestinians and Israelis, there were two Palestinians sitting in front. And I was sitting at the back of the room, and I could see that they were very uncomfortable with the presentation that Jessica was delivering about the story of the dialogue and all these wonderful moments of coming together, the human moments between the two sides. And at some point, I pointed out to the chair that the two Palestinians, I could see that there was something in their body, the way that their bodies were tensing, that they wanted to say something. So as the panel was closing, they invited them. I said, we want to know what's going on, because I could feel from the back of the room. And one of them spoke out, and she was in tears. She says, I can't relate to this. One of our colleagues, I think it was the hamburgers, who had helped them somehow to get their visas. I can't remember the story clearly, but they were struggling to get through the checkpoints. And so by the time they arrived in South Africa, they'd gone through a lot of wounding just coming to the conference. And so hearing the story of the dialogue across the divide, they just could not relate to that. And so we heard them, and we heard their pain, and we saw their pain. And yet, the following year, again, Jessica Benjamin came and presented a story of combatants for peace. Young men who come from both sides, who have fought on both sides, who encountered the humanity of one another in some contexts, and decided after that experience that they want to introduce into the discourse of Israel-Palestine a different narrative. And so this was the story that came to our conference in 2012. Again, at the beginning of our preparations, I spoke to Jessica, because she's the only person I know who's connected to this conference, who can help us with inviting Palestinians to this conference. I won't go into details in terms of what happened, but we did not get any. But just what I want to say is that we've had these groups of people, and this story in particular represents for us the idea that this too is important. During our own struggle in South Africa, there were fighters who left the country to join the army. There were people here who were working for SACED in education front. There were very many voices. Our struggles cannot be resolved by one approach. We as citizens need to create new languages of communicating to one another, new ways of engagement.
A heartwarming delight to be with, as they say in this country, Prof. Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela, to be in her company and the company of her community, which she has nurtured on a global scale for decades now. Prof. Pumla, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for making me part of the growing family. I want to thank the University of Stellenbosch for hosting us, and I want to thank you very much for being here this morning. Now, the talk I'm going to give today intersects with various interests of mine, and in particular, at the request of Prof. Pumla, I'm going to talk about some of the work I've been doing on the humanities, language, or what I call enunciation, and violence, and ways of actually overcoming some of the problems created. But I want to put it in the frame of the humanities. And indeed, this work comes from a larger work that I'm preparing in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. In fact, sections of it were from there, but I had to edit it for the purposes of speaking about neighborhood and neighborliness in Rwanda, which was Prof. Pumla's request. But in the work that I'm doing, the shadow of James Baldwin falls long and falls extremely relevantly over a whole tradition of writers, Morrison, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and of course the remarkable poet with whom I'm working, Claudia Rankine. So let me then start with what I call the framework of the humanities, to talk about language, philology, politics, anxiety, and some kind of reconciliation and neighborliness. I want to start with two citations. The first from Hannah Arendt, our enchantment with humanity did not even conceive of the terror of the idea of humanity. For the idea of humanity, when purged of all sentimentality, has the very serious consequence that in one form or another, men and women must assume responsibility for all crimes committed by them, and that all nations share the onus of evil committed by all others. To follow a non-imperialist policy and maintain a non-racist faith becomes daily more difficult because it becomes daily clearer how great a burden mankind is for man. My second citation. Perhaps there is a word that captures the meaning of these encounters between victims and perpetrators, and it is grasp. To grasp means both understanding and taking hold of the order. In order to hold of something, one has to reach for it, and here may be found echoes of the phenomenological notion of intentionality. Prof. Pumla, Gobodo-Madikizela. It's between these two texts that I shall try and find my own voice. A woman student courageously took the floor and voiced her resentment, the professor's report, with a piquant irony. And this is what she said. Being a Hindu, my parents, teachers, and friends would have pardoned me even if I had eloped with a Christian or Muslim boyfriend. But they couldn't forgive me for deserting the pure sciences and joining a course in the humanities. You may well laugh until I continue. It is easy to miss the cultural complexity of this analogy, the incessant anguish that connects the humanities as an outcast discipline to the Hindu woman's fear of being cast out of family and community for being in a relationship with a boyfriend of another faith. What was in 2011, according to the professors, a piquant irony, is in these days of Hindutva nationalist governance a matter of criminal intent and the cause for a serious violation of privacy. Adult Hindu women, referred to as girls to diminish their respect and autonomy, suspected of having Muslim partners, are now accused of love jihad, on the pretext that they will be seduced by sex into converting to Islam. Hindu women are abducted by gangs of Hindu nationalist vigilantes and returned to their families, where they are held hostage, sometimes forced into marriages, and they'll have to wait until they can appeal to the courts or to NGOs for their freedom. On occasion, they are disappeared or simply killed. The stature of the humanities has steadily declined in India. The status of girl women in India is gravely compromised. More history hangs on an analogy than is immediately apparent. Sundar Sarukai's response to the abandoned women's confession of academic apostasy presents an unexpected challenge. To learn to think like a humanist, he tells his demoralized Trivandrum audience, you should read Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. To this excellent curriculum, I would have added Edward Said's fine work of philological humanism, After the Last Sky, Scenes of Regular Life Inside Palestine, Min Dakhil Palestine, which reveals the remarkable power of narrative to endure and enunciate moments when a people's history seems to be in hiatus, lives broken by walls, and memories rendered piecemeal and partial. In Trivandrum, the city of the Indian rocket launchpad project and India's first technopark, Sarukai argues against the curricular privilege afforded to technical and scientific rationalism by the Indian Constitution, and warns that the hegemony of instrumental knowledge could lead to the banality of evil, or, as Arendt describes it in a late essay, the non-wicked everybody who has no special motives, and for this reason, of having no special motives, is capable of infinite evil. The ethical relation to thinking and speaking that I'm arguing for resonates, I believe, with Levinas's thoughts, not simply on the face, but on what he writes it means to make oneself into a conscience in the context of the interhuman realm of justice, with a view to equality and equity, a weigh, a calculation, the comparison of incomparables, the necessity of thinking together beneath one synthetic theme, the multiplicity and the unity of the world. In a moral fable that could have been written by John Coetzee's wise and utterly obtrusive Elizabeth Costello, Arendt turns to Socrates' contesting dialogue with Hippias to describe what it means to actualize alterity in consciousness with the purpose of activating the moral agency of conscience. Arendt writes, when Socrates goes home, he is awaited by a very obnoxious fellow who always cross-examines him, a close relative living in the same house who compels him to actualize the difference within himself, for moral and political agency. It is only when we actualize the difference within our identity as given in consciousness that we enter the witness box of ethical self-cross-examination and find ourselves in a position that may prevent catastrophes in the rare moments when the chips are down. In Justice Albisakh's Königsberger lecture, The Building of an Inclusive Society Based on Human Rights, he provides, I believe, an image of how alterity can be translated into political solidarity. He asks us to imagine his own story, his own experiences, his own performance of thinking from the perspective of, and I quote him, somebody else and somebody else and somebody else of different skin color, different appearance, different language, different background, different beliefs, as agents in the same struggle for the multiple unity of a new South Africa.